Hey, I'm David Huey, and I am an enthusiast when it comes to aquariums. And I've been involved with the hobby for 17 or 18 years now. And I'm starting a playlist on my YouTube channel, which has very little content at this time, to kind of share my experience as I go along with new projects. And I know over the years, as I've read forums and watched YouTube videos, I've gotten a ton of help. And I think that since I've been involved with this hobby for so long, maybe I have something to offer. I really like watching other people talk about their new tank setups and challenges and mistakes and how they overcame things and things they're learning. I just thought I'd kind of jump in and share from my perspective as well. So this first video is kind of a historical retrospective on what I've been doing with previous aquariums. I've had a few projects in the past. I have some photos, so I'll be showing those and talking about those. I don't really have any video footage from previous tanks, but I can at least show you how things have progressed, how I began with the hobby, and where I've ended up and where I plan to go from here. So hope you enjoy, and here we go. I've always had a thing for taking care of pets and plants and things like that. So many years ago at my first job, I thought it would be a great idea to have a fish in a bowl on my desk. Well, as soon as I started to do the research on how to care for a goldfish, I quickly came to the conclusion that it was a horrible idea. I didn't know anything about water chemistry or biology, and the more I saw, the more I figured out that I'm probably just going to have a torture scenario on my desk at work, and that didn't sound like such a great idea. So in addition to that, I also saw that probably the best idea for a beginner starting their first aquarium was to go a little larger because it's easier to maintain stable water parameters in a larger aquarium than it is a much smaller environment. So what started as an idea for a goldfish in a bowl quickly evolved into a 55-gallon aquarium in my apartment. I was so excited to have a box of water in my apartment. That's pretty much as simple as it was. It was just a glass tank purchased at my local fish store, T12 light fixture on top, black gravel, probably black painted gravel, and under gravel filter, and that's pretty much it. Under the cabinet, there was probably nothing but a small net and some fish food. In order to save some money, I built my own cabinet, and it was pretty rudimentary, but it did the job. Basically just plywood slapped together over a 2x4 frame and some paint. Even the doors were just pieces of plywood that I cut out and put some hinges on. Screwed a couple of knobs into it and attached them to the face frame. So as a beginner aquarium guy, or whatever you call it, aquarist? Aquariumer? I don't know. Anyway, I just started grabbing random things that I would see from time to time, like river rock or lava rock or slate, or hey, let's put a plant in there and see what happens. And of course, I didn't know anything about taking care of aquatic plants, so they didn't do well. The plants would start getting brown spots and turning yellow and basically dissolving in the aquarium. So I started doing some research on how to take better care of aquatic plants. I stumbled upon the great, wide, wonderful world of aquatic gardening, aquascaping, live planted aquariums, and my eyes were opened and I realized this is what I want to start doing. So I start learning about lights and CO2 injection and water hardness and nutrients, and started adding a few more plants, and quickly realized that my whole setup is wrong and I've pretty much got to start over. So as things inevitably go, I start getting rid of a lot of the original equipment that I purchased and putting in new things. Away goes the under gravel filter and the T12 bulbs of God knows what spectrum, and I put in a canister filter, and I think I got a T5 light fixture with some daylight bulbs. Just daylight bulbs. I didn't know anything about Kelvin yet or anything like that, or PAR ratings or depth of light penetration. So I think I started doing DIY CO2 with this tank, where I was using yeast and sugar in a 2-liter bottle, basically going through an air line into an air stone that was in the aquarium. So as things progressed, I started adding more plants, and I built a canopy to cover the lighting, and just kind of started advancing a little bit and experimenting a little bit more. And obviously, the aquarium has come a long way, even with this first tank, from where it started with my fancy piece of red lava rock and slate stone, not to mention my mold injected plastic driftwood. So here's just a few more pictures of my first aquarium as it reached maturity prior to me moving into our first house. And the next aquarium was a little bit of an evolved effort, and we'll take a look at that now. So my next aquarium was 120 gallons. It was 4 by 2 by 2, and the stand and canopy that I built were a little bit nicer than the previous, a little bit more trim, and kind of decided to go with a stain instead of painting. This aquarium had an overflow in it, and it was drilled and plumbed at the bottom of the tank. And the reason that I did that was two reasons. One, the overflow is a great way to do surface skimming, which was an issue that I had with the previous tank, where I was always battling that film of protein that builds up on the top of the water. And that inhibits, gas exchange with the water and also light penetration. There were some pros and cons to this approach. One of the problems would be small shrimp or tetras getting into that overflow box and swimming around or crawling around near the bottom, and it's just difficult to get those things out with a net when you're working around all those pipes and everything in a narrow space. But I did like being able to conceal the heater and the pH probe back there and not have those visible in the main part of the aquarium. I also upgraded from DIY CO2 to building a Rex Griggs style CO2 reactor and getting a Milwaukee regulator and an aluminum CO2 cylinder. And I definitely enjoyed the longevity of CO2 being steadily injected into the tank without having to mess around with plastic bottles and yeast and sugar and air lines and air stones. And in a 120-gallon aquarium, 5-pound CO2 cylinder was lasting me probably a good 2.5 or 3 months between refills. Additionally, having a CO2 regulator is nice because you can kind of tweak the rate at which the CO2 is flowing into the tank, and you can't really do that with a DIY CO2 setup using plastic bottles and airline. This particular reactor that I built was okay. It worked pretty good. One thing I shouldn't have done was use 90-degree elbows for the inlet and outlet, because that does impede the water flow. So it's best not to restrict water flow when doing things like that. I got a couple of huge pieces of driftwood, and in order to keep those from floating when I set the tank up, I put down a piece of plastic light diffuser grid that I got at Home Depot, and then I zip tied the driftwood to that, and that held it down so it wasn't able to float when I filled it up with water. I tried white sand with my first layout attempt, and that didn't really go too well. I noticed it was trying to accumulate algae rather quickly, and it was having to be cleaned all the time. And over time, I didn't really like having to see the substrate in the back mixing with the white sand in the front. And I didn't really know what I was doing still. I was just trying to emulate what I had seen in pictures, but I didn't really understand a lot of the fundamentals of aquascaping that are practiced by the pros out there yet. So the next few pictures will show that I've tried a lot of different layouts in this particular tank. One thing about planted tanks and trying to have a nice aquascape is that it does take a lot of patience, and it's difficult if you're a person like me who just is tweaking things, moving things, having different ideas, being impatient, things like that. And it just takes patience and takes time to let something grow in and mature. Eventually I started to discover that less is more, so I took a lot of the busyness out, went back to kind of one piece of wood, minimal numbers of plants or types of plants, And I started to realize this is kind of what I was looking for. Um, it's kind of a natural tendency when you first start getting into doing planted tanks to want to have a lot of stuff going on, and that's certainly a great approach. I mean, there's a lot of really busy aquascapes out there that just look awesome, but for me, I just kind of started realizing that my particular taste is that less is more. And so here's some final shots of the tank as it was before I sold this house and sold this tank and then moved on to the next project. So this brings us to my third aquarium project, and fortunately I have some photos of the process of building the cabinet, and I took a little bit of a, as it always goes, every time you do a new project, you've taken what you've learned, you've taken the mistakes you made in the past, and you do a better job moving forward. And so instead of just kind of taking a big piece of plywood and cutting out 2 holes for the doors, this time I built more of a face frame on the front. I used a Craig pocket hole jig to join the face frame pieces together using red oak that I bought at Home Depot, and ultimately just had a more finished look to it. Another thing I did a little differently was I added crown molding to the top of the cabinet to kind of match the crown molding that was at the top of the built-in bookshelves in my office. And I thought that was pretty neat. It had a neat look, and it gave me the opportunity to do something kind of unique that I'll show you in just a minute. And I trimmed out the bottom, trimmed out the top, had a nice face frame. It just looked more solid and more professional. And here's a close-up of the finish, just to kind of show that I had an antique black finish on it. So I painted the cabinet black, but then I kind of sanded it down, and where there were the areas of exposed wood, I would go back in with a dark walnut stain and kind of darken the exposed wood color. So ultimately you ended up with a antique black finish that matched the doors and shelves in my office. So going back to the crown molding that was around the top of the aquarium cabinet, what that gave me the opportunity to do was to cover the trim of the bottom of the tank and expose some of the elements that would be inside the tank to the outside of the tank. I kind of wanted to have some of the elements in the aquarium readily exposed or accessible or tangible, if you will, to the person viewing the tank. And that included the driftwood as well. I wanted a piece of driftwood that protruded out of the top of the tank, and I wanted the rocks that were in the tank to be outside the tank, almost as if that glass wasn't really there. The aquarium itself I had built to a different spec this time around. This time I wanted to go with a shallower tank, 18 inches tall instead of 24 inches tall. My reasoning behind that was I didn't want to have trouble with the light penetration not being strong enough to reach the bottom of a 24-inch deep tank, especially with the lights being mounted around 8 to 10 inches from the surface of the aquarium. So I wanted to have stronger carpet plants and things like that, so I just wanted to increase the light intensity that reached the bottom of the aquarium. So I went with a shorter tank, and since it was shorter, I made it wider, so 18 inches tall, 5 feet wide. That amounted to about 112 gallons, so I still had plenty of volume. I still wanted 2 feet front to back because you need some depth to do a good tank layout with your plants and hardscape. I got some Kessel LED lights, and those were pretty much the coolest lights I could find on the market at the time. They were not cheap, but it was really neat to have strong, powerful, and in my mind they were elegant and small. It's kind of a unique look, mounted pendants versus a big giant rectangle of an LED array. This shot shows the driftwood that I chose. It was a nice big piece that came out of the top, and I really liked that. I was really excited as I was going along and setting things up. I'll never forget the way I felt when I had this piece of driftwood sitting in there and turned on those lights for the first time and saw the drama of the shadows and the light on that wood and the way it came out of the tank and the rocks on the outside and the cool elegant looking mounted pendants, and I just thought, wow, this is definitely the coolest tank I've ever done so far, and I was just having a great time. I used the same approach of putting the plastic light diffuser grid at the bottom so that I could zip tie the wood down to it. And also, I liked the idea of being able to protect the glass from large rocks if I ever wanted to put them in there. Those would kind of distribute the weight of those rocks. You set a big heavy rock on that grid, and that grid's going to take that weight and distribute it across the whole width of the grid. This is just kind of showing how I started adding the substrate in my thought. It would be a neat idea to have a layout where the substrate was elevated in the rear as well as in the front. So rear left, front right, two elevated areas with kind of a valley in the middle going kind of diagonal. One of the ways that I would keep the substrate from trying to erode or fall with the weight of the water, if you will, over time, was I got this plastic needlepoint material from Hobby Lobby and kind of built little terraced barriers. There were rocks holding the plastic in place, and then I would put the substrate in over that, and it also worked as a barrier for the roots. So if you're planting valves or other plants that are kind of creepy, crawly, invasive over time, this was kind of a neat way to keep those roots from invading other areas of the tank that I didn't want those plants to be growing. This is just a picture of the Eheim Pro 3 canister filter that I put in there, along with the new CO2 reactor that I built for this tank. And I gotta say, this is not a good design for a CO2 reactor. Don't do your CO2 inlet at the top. Obviously you want the CO2 to come in near the top of your reactor, but I found that gas would build up at the top of this reactor. What you really want to do with a Rex Griggs style CO2 reactor is to have your water flowing in from the top. That way the gas is coming in just under that top water flow and breaking up as the water flows down through the reactor. You'll also notice that I have a large plastic tub that the reactor and the filter are sitting inside of, and I will always do this going forward. I never had a disaster, but I started thinking about it. I have hardwood floors, and I just thought, you know, if I started having a leak, it would be nice if I could find a flooded tub instead of a flooded floor, and then just address the problem and go from there. You just never know what might go wrong with a valve or something like that, or a fitting with any of this kind of canister filter or CO2 type equipment. So here's the tank after I first did the layout and filled it up. Eventually I didn't really like that slope in the front. The idea didn't play out so well after all, so I kind of leveled it out and started growing in my carpet. This is an HC carpet that was growing in. I really liked how it was turning out. I thought it was really nice. I like the simplicity. Again, minimal number of plants, not a lot of hardscape material. It just does a good enough job. This tank was probably by far the best one I'd ever done, and the most successful. I found somebody out of Fort Worth that wanted to buy it. I was able to sell the entire setup. They wanted to break it down, take it home, and set it up exactly like this, and that's just what they did. So I sold this house and moved into another house and am ready to start a new project. So this next project is going to be a 120-gallon tank again, going back to the 4x2x2 dimensions, and this time I'm going to do it with an acrylic tank. I'll talk all about that with the unboxing video that I'm going to do when my aquarium arrives. And this new project is going to be video documented from start to finish instead of photo documented like my previous tanks. So I'll use this playlist that I started on YouTube. I'll keep posting new videos here. My next video is going to be all the gear that's going to go into the next project. I'm just going to lay it all out and talk about everything piece by piece. And then I'll probably start doing some individual videos on each of those individual components and why I chose them. So I'm looking forward to sharing my future experience with everybody, and thanks for watching. I started to quickly find out what a horrible an idea it is to keep a fish in. What is an idea? What is an idea? Quickly saw that the easiest way to maintain a stable environment, especially for beginners,